So JG, you're become like the Michael Jordan of sticky note throwing.
I kind of am.
A free throw shot, like the Michael Jordan of sticky notes. Wow.
I wouldn't mind a new handle on Instagram, Michael Jordan of Sticky Notes. That's cool with me.
Well, no, you earned it.
All right, Patrick, I have 6 sticky notes in front of me. We're going to start by summarizing the problems that are going on in the real estate market right now. There are quite a few for many people. Some people are absolutely killing it, but a lot of people are having a difficult time with some of the real challenges that are going on. And we're talking about real estate investors, but we're also talking about everyday people that have mortgages and jobs and families and challenges. And as a real estate investor, to be successful in these types of markets, you truly have to be a deal engineer and you really have to be a problem solver. We're going to talk about how to solve problems in a minute. But first, let's kind of set up, Patrick, these problems that are going on in the real estate market and how they're affecting people.
Well, it's an interesting time, isn't it? Because from our perspective, doing the research that we do and educating real estate investors and investors looking into the market, we're always looking at the housing market. We're looking at the economy. We're considering all the great things that are going on. But underneath the surface, there's a lot of challenges. We talk about CPI, the cost of inflation that people are facing, the rising interest rates. Well, what does that really mean? To us as investors, we're looking primarily and saying, well, how can I buy property for cash flow? And how can I do this or that? And rents are going up because the cost of living is in fact rising and the cost of housing is in fact rising. So got all that. We talk about it all the time. But underlying is really a problem that's starting to grow. And I think we're just at the tip of it and it's going to roll. It's going to be a big wave coming at us. And that is the challenges of, like you say, just everyday, ordinary individuals, JG, who are challenged. They got, rising costs because they took out a line of credit. They have mortgages that are renewing, that their payments are going up dramatically. They've got the cost of living in one province. They're saying, I got to get out of here. I got to go to a different province. Maybe they're going to go from Ontario to Alberta, BC to Alberta, Alberta to Saskatchewan, because they got to get to a place where they can afford. And here's the fundamental problem that's happening, because we're doing some research on the banking side of it. And that is,
drum roll, please.
People are running into, I cannot afford to hang on to this property anymore. This home, I got to get from underneath it. And this is where the challenge lies, JG. And as investors, if we can come in and solve those problems, guess what? Lots of opportunity, lots of win-win situations that we can create.
I think the question becomes, how do we solve those problems as real estate investors? We'll talk about the exact tactics and strategies in a minute on how to do that. But Patrick, we've got some great charts and some great visuals to share here. And CPI, Consumer Price Index, is a good example of it is definitely starting to come down, but it's not coming down equally in all different provinces, right? You and I often say on this show that real estate is regional. And as the Consumer Price Index comes back towards a new normal, love that tagline that seems to have stuck for many, many years now. I think it's going to stick around for a couple decades, by the way. But the new normal of what the Consumer Price Index is, it's coming differently at different provinces. For example, Ontario is down 5 points. CPI has only grown by 5.6%. Now, I want to just take a minute because a lot of people watching this show may not know this, Patrick. But when people say the Consumer Price Index is coming down and they're looking at a chart like this, what it's really saying, the truth of it is it's 5.6% higher than it was last year. And last year was 8.6% higher than the year before. So this 5.6, Patrick, is on top of the other 8.6. It's not like it's come down 5.6%. The growth and the acceleration of growth has slowed, but the overall Consumer Price Index is still up.
Well, you're exactly right. And on top of that, in this case, you're talking about Ontario, but it doesn't matter. CPI, up 5.6%. Well, that's an aggregate number. And what we have to look is behind the curtain of what makes up that CPI basket, if you will. And as we know, many of those numbers change and shift, and that's just kind of how the government does it. But what we do know about CPI is those things that we buy on a day-to-day basis are actually not going down. And for example, we have food prices that have gone up and continue to go up. And also as part of CPI is shelter. And in that shelter, that many people don't know, is the cost of interest on the mortgages. That's part of it as well. So, it's an aggregate. And as much as some things have come down, many things have not come down at all. As a matter of fact, they've gone up.
You lead us right into another chart, Patrick. We have a great chart here. I believe it's by it's by RBC Economics here. And you can see how the affordability issues is really at a peak here in terms of ownership costs as a percentage of household income. It is as high as it's ever been on this chart back to 1985. But there is a forecast that this is going to go down, and they're forecasting it to go down, Patrick, for the exact reason you talked about, because in RBC's mind, interest rates are at their peak and they're going to be coming down now. We're going to start coming down. As a result, affordability gets better because the cost of interest comes down. So this is a very interesting chart that RBC puts out, but not all the analysts are seeing it the same way. And in fact, in other charts we have to share, and then you can comment on both of this, Patrick, is speaking of analysts, the job market has just come out in January with 10 times more jobs created than the analysts predicted. It happened in December. It happened again in January. I'm starting to think these analysts got to be fired, Patrick.
You're fired.
Well, they have that room, that margin of error, because they stayed up front. It's just a forecast.
10x? Is 10x a good margin of error? I mean, I have a margin of error too, but come on, 10x?
I know, it is unbelievable, isn't it? And it's not the first time that they've been that wrong. I'm still waiting for some corrections to come in, but they have not come in. So how do they end up being that wrong? I have no idea. But the reality of it is, those are what the numbers are. That's good for us from a housing perspective. As investors, of course, that increases the rental market. It keeps the demand high on the housing sector, which, given the lack of listings, that's going to keep prices elevated as well. But I don't want to go too far down that path just yet, JG, because when we go back to what we were talking about from the affordability part, RBC released that chart. It's a forecast of what they think bond yields are going to be and what long-term rates are going to be. So they're looking into 2024 before rates actually start to come back a little bit. They don't foresee rates rising in 2023. That's still debatable. We'll see what the Bank of Canada does. You and I have both agreed in the past, or at least I've agreed with myself, that, Bank of Canada has made some, epic errors. We're seeing what's happened. But what is happened is that they had that increase in rates, JG. It was rapid and it was severe, from 0.25 or whatever that number was to 4.25, 4.5, whatever the final number is these days. I'm just not coming to mind. But the point is, it was a rapid rise. It caught many people off guard. You and I know that. Lines of credits doubled and tripled. People are renewing mortgages that were at 2.25% and even 3% are now 5.25%. And then on top of that, you've got others that are facing the fact that they had a down payment, but because of their household income, it's not enough to qualify for a mortgage. So these are all challenges that are being faced by many just people with houses that exist. They've got too much debt. The debt loads are skyrocketing. They're at 185%, by the way, which I don't have a chart on, but it's 185% of what they're carrying for a debt load. It's crushing people because of the interest rates and, of course, the cost of living overall.
Now, one of the effects of this, Patrick, you just talked about, is how this is tightening up the rental demand. This is actually making rentals more popular than ever before. Shoot, we didn't have room for more people to want to rent. It was already tight enough as it is. But if you look at this chart I'm putting on the screen now, the rental market vacancy rate is at an all-time low since 2001. And again, that's just indicating the tightness. And that's for a variety of reasons, part of what we're talking about here today. But all of this kind of adds up to, Patrick, problems. And in this market, in a market like we're in right now, successful real estate investors must solve problems. If you're not solving problems, really not getting deals done. There's no silver bullets out there. There's no gold nuggets hanging around on the street where you're just going to put in a good offer and get it. You have to be able to solve problems to be able to grow a portfolio in this market. But I must say, Patrick, even though you have to use different tactics, which we'll talk about in a second, this is the best kind of market to grow a fantastic, resilient portfolio, because you have to be that much more creative. You have to be that much better than everybody else. And you have to be sophisticated in order to be successful in this type of market.
You nailed it. The level of sophistication has to come up. The level of knowledge and understanding what's going on in the market has to rise, because you have to be there to understand that in these markets, in this chaos, in this confusion and uncertainty, this is where the opportunities live for investors who are educated, who have that actual mindset, and I guess putting themselves in an environment, in a community that they can have these conversations to use tactics and strategies to solve problems. And JG, we can't stress enough that the problems are only just beginning. We're only just hearing about it. And we know it to be true because, again, we're seeing banks react. They're actually shifting their lending rules. They're extending amortizations. They're figuring out a way to not put people under pressure, which is awesome. But they're running into one fundamental problem, and that is people continue to run into problems. And this is where investors not only can be there to solve the problem, but the exit on the other side of it, if they want to be in a buy and hold strategy, is that the rental demand is still there, and or the demand for listings and sales is still there.
So if you're Patrick, if you're an investor and you want to be a sophisticated investor and you want to solve problems, in our world, you need 5 tools in your tool belt. If you imagine yourself with a tool belt around your waist, you need 5 tools in your tool belt. And what we're going to do now is kind of go through these 5 tools. And these are 5 essentially deal structures in order for you to help people solve problems. And Patrick, I'm actually actively using several of these right now, where I'm actually in the process of negotiating deals with people in order to help them get out from under these problems. So those 5 kind of tools in your tool belt, Patrick, and we'll go through and summarize each one. But the first one is an agreement for sale strategy. Very, very unique, very, very creative. We'll touch on that in a second. So agreement for sale is number 1. Number 2, vendor take back. Vendor takebacks is a way to finance a property, and we'll touch on that in just a minute. The third way is wholesaling. Wholesaling is a fantastic way for you to either purchase property at a great rate or be able to flow property through your hands and make some additional cash flow along the way in order to help somebody else solve a problem. So wholesaling is another great strategy. RTO, one of our fan favorites, Patrick. Rent to own agreements, or what's called leasing options, is another sophisticated investor strategy that we're going to touch on. And the last one, which we don't always talk about in these kind of tough times, because those 4 are kind of the primary 4 tools. But the other 5th one is just as important, and that is joint ventures. You know, these kinds of problems and challenges that people have run into open up the opportunity for a joint venture partnership conversation that otherwise wasn't there before. And if you're creative and if you have a way to structure deals, this is a great time to be doing joint ventures. And it's a great way for someone to grow and scale a portfolio during tough times like this. So Patrick, are you ready to dive deep into these 5 strategies?
Let's get to work.
All right, Patrick, as a sophisticated real estate investor, your first tool in your tool belt right here. Now, I'm not saying it's the number 1 tool. I'm just saying it's the first tool, like a tool, because these 5 are not like this is the best tool and that's the second best tool and this is the third best tool. These are just 5 phenomenal creative tactics and strategies to help people out of problems and help you as a real estate investor grow and scale your portfolio. One of the first tools we want to talk about is agreements for sale, Patrick. Very creative strategy. For most, I would say, not a known tactic to 98% of investors out there. Very, very advanced tactic, but what an amazing tactic. So just kind of start by defining what agreement for sale is, Patrick, and then we'll talk about where it could be used.
Well, an agreement for sale is a form of vendor financing, and this really works well for investors, particularly those investors who have hit a ceiling of limitation in terms of the mortgages they can get. Because when I talk about vendor financing, really what it is you're coming in to solve a problem for a vendor. That vendor has got transferred, they don't have equity in the home, yet they have to sell that property. There's been a death in the family, a divorce. Either way, they got to get from underneath the property. They've got an existing mortgage in place, and it doesn't make sense for them to sell. Now, an agreement for sale is the opportunity for an investor to come in, put the agreement together. And by the way, there's nuances and there's a level of sophistication to these agreements, but that's why you've got great lawyers. But the point is that what you're doing is you're taking over the principal, the interest, the taxes, the insurance. You're taking over responsibility entirely for that property from the vendor, but they maintain that mortgage. The mortgage remains in their name, as does the title. All of that is wrapped around all of that has an agreement wrapped around it that is referred to as an agreement for sale. But then you take on all responsibility. The vendor can then move on to whatever the vendor wants to do, and you will hold that property for 1, 3, 5, even sometimes 10 years, where you don't have to go back to the bank to qualify for a mortgage, JG. And this is a very, very effective strategy for investors who take the time to understand how to use that tool.
First and foremost, Patrick, this tactic and strategy works across the country. Now, it's very popular in in Alberta, very popular in Alberta, very popular in Saskatchewan, not as popular in places like BC and Ontario, but it is doable in all provinces. And actually, when we were talking to Barry McGuire the other day, he was pointing out how back in the day, as in like pre-World War II and pre-Great Depression, this was the way to buy a property. Like this was one of the only ways to buy a property. And one of the main ways to buy property. And over time, we've gotten away from the tactic, but it's been around that long, Patrick. It's been around for 100 plus years, this tactic. It's not brand new. We didn't just create this. We have resurrected it probably about 2 decades ago, and it works incredibly well for the right investor at the right time.
Yeah, and just to your point, JG, is that as popular as it was in Western Canada, what's happening now is because the demand and really the challenges that many, many homeowners are facing is that it's opened up a whole new doorway for lawyers to support this. So in fact, what I'm saying is that in Ontario, where we're seeing a lot of these challenges because of just sheer volume of people that live in Ontario, is that lawyers are actually embracing the strategy and embracing agreements for sale. And so now more than ever, Ontario is open for business when it comes to agreements for sale. It's like a really, really great opportunity.
Now, where do you use an agreement for sale is a great question. And we, by the way, folks, if you're watching this, we always do a variety of webinars and working sessions for our community on this stuff. But just quickly to understand where to use an agreement for sales, you've heard of probably people being underwater on their mortgage. That means that they owe more on the property than the property's worth in the current market. Now, in today's market, Patrick, for some people that bought condos at the tip top, or they bought pre-construction condos at the tip top of the market last year, some people are in this position right now and they want to get out from underneath that stress. And an agreement for sale is a great way to do it without them having to liquidate everything and, in fact, pay the market to sell their condo. An agreement for sale could be one tactic to move that over to an investor and it helps both the person who owns the condo who's underwater, and it helps the investor.
Well, it's something that we need to shine a light on is because somebody listening to this goes, well, why don't they just sell the property then if it's that bad? Well, the problem that they've got, to your point, it's underwater, so there's no equity in it. So they phone the realtor and say, I'd like to sell my property. The realtor looks at it and goes, okay, well, we have a problem here because there's not enough margin in here for me to get paid. And so as a realtor, my job is to get paid. I want to sell your property, but there's not enough in here. So if there's a $20,000 commission or 25 or 15 or whatever the number is, if they don't have that spread, that means the vendor is actually going to have to come up with that cash to pay the realtor. And of course, that is part of the problem because the vendors typically that are going to go for this kind of a deal don't have the cash to pay the realtor.
Yeah, very advanced strategy, folks. So we urge you to, join the community, get involved with the Real Estate Investment Network so you can learn this kind of tactic because very, very advanced and not for the faint of heart, but you got to know what you're doing. You have to be educated before you do this, but incredibly powerful tactic in this particular market condition.
Let me just comment on what you just finished there. And just to say this, is that it is a very advanced kind of strategy to use. But for investors who want to take it on and learn it, there's some great opportunity for profits in this. And so like anything, if you want to make really big money, you have to actually educate yourself in order to set yourself up to win in these scenarios.
Agreements for sale covered. We did. Good shot. I like it. My aim is right on today. I love it. Next, let's talk about vendor takebacks, Patrick. This is a tactic that's near and dear to my heart because if I didn't know about this tactic, I would not be in real estate today. In my very first real estate deal, I needed to execute on a vendor takeback in order to get into the market. And right now, this is a time when a vendor takeback mortgage is a fantastic idea and definitely is open to certain people. But it's something that has a window of opportunity. And what I mean by that is this tactic typically works better in down markets like we're in right now. Not like a year ago, you would be hard pressed to do a vendor take back deal. But in today's market, people are open to vendor take back deals because properties are not moving as fast and people are not getting as much for their properties. Therefore, they're open to a vendor take back. So let's start, Patrick. Tell us, what is a vendor take back real quick?
Well, there's different levels of vendor take back mortgage, but ultimately what's happening, and to your point, JG, when I bought my first property, or one of my first properties, I used a vendor take back mortgage, which is to say this. In my case, the property had been paid off and it was an investor that owned that property. They didn't want to get set up for capital gains, and I had put a great offer on the table for them saying, I'll buy the property, you carry the mortgage. So in this case, the vendor became the bank. I agreed to an interest rate, I agreed to a term, and an amortization I used for the math was 25 years in my case, but ultimately the vendor becomes the bank. And then typically that doesn't happen all that often, other than it's a great exit strategy for some investors because they want to defer that capital gains tax up to 5 years, by the way, by following that strategy. Now, the other side of that is on a vendor take back mortgage, where you're dealing with somebody who you can't, or you don't want to necessarily go to the bank for the full amount of a mortgage, or you can't qualify, and the vendor actually carries a portion of that mortgage. They agree to carry some portion of it and you pay it on that regard.
Well, here's a good example, Patrick. When you talk about people not being able to qualify for maybe 80% or 95% of a mortgage because they don't meet the qualification ratios, because the banks have different qualification ratios. If you went to the bank and you weren't asking for 95%, you were asking for 50%, that's a very different scenario, Patrick. So quick little example of how a vendor take back or a VTB can work very much in your favor as a buyer and as a seller, because you talked about the tax consequences, Patrick, but there's also a cash flow and a wealth effect component to VTBs, vendor takebacks, that people don't understand, which is, let's just say I own this building outright, okay? And I want to sell it. I want to get out from this building because let's just say I'm liquidating my portfolio, and over the course of the next 10 years, I'm going to start selling off buildings. I want to sell this building, but I don't want $1 million of cash in my bank account. I mean, it doesn't serve me to have $1 million of cash in my bank account. I'm actually more interested in saying, listen, I'll get rid of this building. I will sell you this building and I will finance a good chunk of it for you. That way I get residual cash flow over the course of the next 5 years, 7 years, 10 years. It helps my tax consequence. It helps my cash flow. It helps me make a plan in the future for this money. It's really a win-win for both the buyer and the seller. The thing is most people don't understand vendor takebacks. Most realtors don't understand vendor takebacks. And as a result, that's where deals break down. But sophisticated investors can explain the tactic, and as a result, deals get done.
100%. And we see it done within the REIN community all the time. And, what's really great is that, when it even comes from a raising capital point of view, all of these tactics that we're talking about, by the way, there's a lot of capital sitting on the sidelines. And when you can start to offer these strategies to your capital partner, where you've got a plan, you've got an exit strategy, a vendor take back, like any of it is all part of what you can fold into a joint venture. And that's why vendor takebacks are becoming more popular through these times, because people need to exit, as again, for all the reasons they need to. And with the financing challenges that we're facing, it's a strategy that we got to embrace.
Yeah. And I think the important thing with all these strategies, folks, we're trying to point out is, when we say there are problems, don't think of these as only negative problems like a death or a divorce or some type of, there could be a challenge, like, for example, having too much money in the bank. That is a problem. Huh? It's a good problem, but it's a problem. And a VTB is a solution to that. So vendor take back, fantastic tactic. Patrick, I'm really glad we talked about VTBs. One of my favorites, near and dear to my heart. Next, let's talk about wholesaling. I also love this one, Patrick. It is a fantastic. I look at wholesaling a little bit like a Swiss Army knife strategy. You could use it in so many different tactics to either acquire deals or sell deals, generate cash or generate wealth. I love wholesaling because it can be very quick. It can happen literally. I did a wholesale deal, and I can give the example if you want, Patrick, where it literally took me one phone call in 20 minutes to make $40,000. It was incredible. And even though those deals don't happen every day, when they do happen, let me tell you, you're pretty happy about it.
Well, there's something about this strategy that's really great. First and foremost, it's an income generating strategy, income today. So it isn't like a buy and hold. We all love buy and hold, but that is income producing in the future. Whereas wholesaling deal is income today. Now, it may take a few weeks or even potentially a few months, not traditionally, but actually it's income in your pocket today. And what you need to do to put the parts together, guess what? First and foremost, you need a great realtor generally. You need a great buyer's list. And one of the reasons that they work for you, JG, is, let's face it, you can pick up a call, you can pick up the phone and call any of your potential buyers who might be interested in this deal. So you have something to pass on. So for somebody who's into wholesaling, you have 2 or 3 key components to it, depending on how much you want to embrace the strategy. Some do it full time, JG. I mean, they have websites and they're out hunting for deals. They do it in a big way. But we have members that literally are coming across deals, and they may do 2 or 3 over the course of a year, but they're making 20, 30, 50, 100 grand in those deals that they're doing. So it's a great strategy to use.
And I think you nailed it there, Patrick, which is, if you want to do some wholesaling, it doesn't mean that's all you're going to do. It doesn't mean you're going to put your entire real estate portfolio on hold and just do wholesaling. But if you understand the tactic, you can do 1 wholesale deal a year or 2 wholesale deals a year, or just understand it's that Swiss Army knife tactic that you have in your back pocket where you're not quite sure what to do with this deal. You might buy it just to resell it. You might buy it just to wholesale it because it's a great deal. Now, Patrick, you pointed it out. Yes, you need a good buyer's list. Yes, you need a good seller's list. Yes, you need the right contacts, but these are things that can be built. When I started in this business, I had none of that. These are things that are built over time, but you're not going to build in that direction unless you understand the tactic. And that's what's important about wholesaling is it doesn't happen overnight, but once you start building up the right connections and the right attitude on wholesaling, man, let me tell you, it is a gorgeous strategy.
Yeah, and let's just go 1 layer deeper in terms of the explanation of wholesaling. At the end of the day, it's also called assignments. That's a term that we often hear. But ultimately, in this case, if you're that bird dog, we'll call it that, if you're that person that happens to come across a deal, which means that you found a property that is being sold undervalued for any number of reasons. Again, in this market, we're going to see more and more of those opportunities start to show up. You can buy that property, you can put an offer on it, you get it locked down, and because you have a buyer's list, you're going, okay, let's say this deal is 50 grand undervalued. Well, guess what you get to do? Phone your buyer and go, something, I got this deal, 50 grand undervalued. I'm going to put 10 grand in it for me, or 15 grand, or whatever number you negotiate, and you're going to put it onto your buyer. That buyer's going to take the deal and go. You didn't have to maybe put any money down, maybe a few $100, depending on what you negotiate. But ultimately, you didn't have to close on the deal, so you didn't have to go and take a mortgage. All you did was lock it up because you found the deal, and then you passed the deal on to generally an investor buyer.
And let me tell you, this is a win-win. And I'll share the story, Patrick, but this is a win-win tactic for everybody. This is a real win-win tactic for the entire real estate ecosystem. And I'll share with this story. This is about 13 months ago. Someone calls me and says, JG, I hear you're an investor. I want to sell this property. And I asked him, I said, do you want to sell this on the open market? Because it's worth more than what you want for it. I asked them what they wanted. They wanted $400,000 for it. And they knew they can get more on the open market, but they wanted fast money. They wanted to close quickly within 3 weeks. And they knew that wouldn't happen on the open market. So I said, sure, I'll buy it from you. And we did an offer. Patrick, you talked about this. I wrote up a contract and I said, I'd buy it from them for $400,000. Excellent. And what I did is I then made a couple phone calls to other investors because I didn't have time to resell the property. I didn't have time to do a proper fix and flip. It needed about $30,000, $40,000 of renovations. I didn't have time for it. So I decided I was going to resell the property to another investor that can do all that work. So I bought it for $400,000. I had the right to close on it for $400,000. I resold it to someone else for $440,000. They paid me $40,000 for the right to purchase that contract at $400,000. So in their cost is $440,000. Now, Patrick, here's what happened. And for viewers out there, you're thinking, wow, they paid 40 grand for that? Yeah, they paid 40 grand for that. Here's what happened next. They put an additional 30 grand into it. So now they're up to $470,000 and they sold it for $625,000. So they made $155,000 on their flip by buying a property. And I made $40,000 by making one particular phone call. So it was a great deal for me. It was a great deal for them. And it was a great deal for the seller because they got their money very, very quickly and had absolutely no hassles. All around, great deal for everybody. Wholesaling, that's why it's so powerful. It's fast and it's good for everyone.
Win, win, win. And you got to approach all the deals like that.
Wholesaling. Love it. Oh, that was a good one there. Okay, next, Patrick, and this one again, kind of like agreements for sale. This one may be a little bit more complex, a little bit more advanced, but that is the rent to own strategy, or often referred to as lease options. Again, Patrick, a lot of investors don't even know this exists, but this is quite a popular strategy. When you get deeper and deeper into the real estate space, you start figuring out, wow, everyone knows about this. Am I the only one who doesn't know about this? And that's because it's very popular, especially in the commercial market. It's very market, and in other markets like multifamily, very, can be very impactful for investors. So tell us about rent to own, what it's all about.
Well, what's really interesting about rent to own right now, why it is such a great strategy, is because the demand is huge. We've got immigration and immigrants flooding into the country, refugees flooding into the country. We have individuals who want to get ahead of the market. They want to buy a piece of property. They want that home to live in. And the challenge that, immigrants are facing, of course, is that they don't have a credit rating. Even if they've got some cash, they still want to live in a home. They want to own that home and put their families in it. And we can get on all sorts of really fascinating conversations about that. But the point is this: if you can be that person that accommodates that, to really facilitate the need for people to buy a home, they have what they call rent to own strategy. Now, that rent to own strategy is really fundamentally, and it's again nuanced like all of these strategies, is that you then work with your tenant buyer. That tenant buyer comes in to say, this is a property that I want to own. This is the price range that I can afford. And you've agreed with him on that or them on that. You see that opportunity. They pay you, by the way, they pay you an option up front as part of the down payment, which is your money. And then you give them a time frame of, let's say, 2 or 3 years, 1 year, 4 years. Not many go over that. But the point is this, is that over that period of time, they're paying you premium rent. They have time to get, let's say, their credit history in order, whether that's a credit repair or just to gain credit. And then knowing that they will then go to the bank at the end of that term and get financing and buy that property. You work in an agreement of what that property will sell for in 2, 3, 4 years, and they exit based on that when they go to the bank. That's a really high level overview of it, JG. Again, it's nuanced, and you have to create the opportunity for yourself to, have I guess you build a business around it, really, to say, here's an opportunity. I'm going to do this. I'm going to take it on. And again, you don't have to do it full time. You do 1, 2, 3 deals a year, and you're putting money in your jeans.
Well, this is what I was going to say, Patrick. This isn't an all or nothing situation. I'm going through one of my properties right now. We have a fantastic tenant. They want to buy. I know they want to buy. They've expressed to me they want to buy. And I have a particular building that I know I'm going to want to sell in 3 years. This is a true story. I'm going through this negotiation right now. I'm going to sell this building in 3 to 5 years. So I'm negotiating with them an RTO deal right now, rent to own deal right now, where they can stay and start purchasing this building from me right now, where a portion of their payments is going to a down payment, so that in 3 to 5 years, we can execute on this deal. What it does for them is, well, number one, they know they have a property that's in their future. So they are totally committed to taking care of this property. It's in amazing shape, and they are just in love with this property. And what it does for me is it guarantees me an exit in 3 to 5 years based on the agreement we structure. And it also guarantees me a certain exit price. So it's a win-win for everybody. And all along the way, I, as the investor, am generating additional cash flow. And they, as the future investor, are prepaying their down payment, which a lot of people need nowadays because down payments are not cheap. So they need help with those down payments. And this is a way you can help people with that. Really all around a win-win, and a great tactic that is very, very good in this marketplace when you have not a lot of deals and a lot of renters.
It is so important to understand for anybody listening to this is, why are we talking about these strategies? Why are we talking about rent to own or wholesaling or agreements for sale, whatever it might be? Because right now is where the opportunities exist. Cannot stress that enough. When we find these markets that are a little chaotic, we've got rising interest rates, we've got people kind of moving all over the country. It is within this kind of uncertainty and this chaos that people need help. And rent to own, agreements for sale, wholesaling are all opportunities for us to do that. Vendor take back mortgages. So as investors, we need to up our game in terms of our knowledge and who we surround ourselves with, JG. We talk a lot about that within the REIN community. put yourself in the right environment, the right community, like-minded individuals, and all of a sudden your game goes up. You have no choice but to play at a different level because you're hanging out with people. Guess what? They're playing that game. And when you start to see what's possible, then these opportunities just all of a sudden go, wow, this makes so much sense.
Rent to own, very, very great tactic to be using in today's marketplace. I love it. The last tactic I want to talk about real quick, Patrick, is joint ventures, because joint ventures in this particular time can be very, very powerful. And I'll share this with a story. I'm going through this right now where I'm working with someone who just finally, after 2 years of making a bad tenant decision, they've had a tenant not paying rent for 2 years. Patrick, has been incredibly painful for them. This single family home is now in quite rough shape. It definitely needs probably $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 of repairs in order to make it a good rental, or B, a good flip to sell on the open market, because it's in that rough of shape. That particular person who just went through this very rough experience, they don't have the cash anymore to do that work. They don't have the $30,000 to $50,000. They're tapped out. And if they sell their property on the open market right now, they're ultimately not going to get max value because it's in very rough shape. Here comes the opportunity for a joint venture where I'm working with this person saying, listen, how about I do the work with you? How about I lend you the money? How about I put in the time, the effort, the energy, the money required to do this, and let's have a deal on the back end where maybe we're going to duplex this property. Maybe we're going to flip it on the open market. Maybe we're going to add a coach home to it. And we're looking at all these, we're still negotiating this deal, but the point is we're looking at all these options to add value. And even though this person can't do it themselves, together we can do it. And none of this would be possible if it wasn't for the attitude of a joint venture creates these types of possibilities. And this is the kind of market, because joint venture partnership agreements help solve problems. And because there's so many problems right now, this is where there's a real opportunity for investors to get great properties and to build some incredible relationships.
Well, you know something, there's so much money sitting on the sidelines, JG, given the uncertainty of the market. Let's face it, many investors who were in the equity market have pulled some or all of their cash out just to keep it safe. But in saying that, we know based on CPI, it's burning up at 5.9% a year on top of an 8.6% the year before and a 5.4% the year before, whatever the numbers are. The point is that, if you've had a couple $100,000 sitting on the sidelines for 2 or 3 years, it's burned up at a rate of about 15% over that time. And I think that's conservative. So ultimately, you've got capital that's sitting on the sidelines that wants to go into what we would call a safe haven, a very risk-off kind of investment. And for those who have the propensity to go after deals and really look after those investors, the risk is pretty low for those investors, and they want their capital to go there because they still believe in real estate. But here's the thing, lots of capital partners don't have the knowledge, they don't have the time or the interest to do what investors are doing, which is to get into the trenches and do the kind of deal that you just described.
Joint ventures, incredible opportunity given the market conditions right now. You might want to check it out. Michael Jordan of Sticky Notes. All right, folks, if you're an existing real estate investor and you want to dig more into these strategies we talked about here today, then you might want to join us at the upcoming Think Tank. Very limited time opportunity. The link for that is in the description below. If you're brand new to real estate investing and you're not quite sure about these strategies, you want to get started on the ground level, then you might want to join us at the Rapid Cash program that we're running very, very soon. The link for that is also in the description below.
Want to learn more and dig into the details of these advanced strategies? Click right here.